LiberalViewer presents.
So almost every open democratic society on earth has rejected the death penalty because, however emotionally satisfying the death penalty may be for some in the abstract, when free people are able to examine the way their own governments administer the machinery of death, they inevitably find wasteful bureaucracy rife with ironic contradictions, which is exactly what Stephen Colbert found out last month about California's death penalty, as you can see in his satirical segment called Tiny Triumphs, Lethal Drug Shortage, beginning with this clip.
Tiny triumphs. Tonight's heartwarming news comes from the heart-stopping world of capital punishment. Recently, the state of California was all set to carry out its first execution in 5 years when they discovered their supply of the lethal drug sodium thiopental had expired on October 1st. Evidently, the bottle had passed its kill-by date.
Now, as amusing as Colbert's coverage of California's lethal drug shortage was there, he left out a lot of background I'd heard about through my volunteer work on the board of an organization dedicated to defending fundamental rights, the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, where I was able to get additional details straight from the attorneys who got those death penalty documents, beginning with ACLU Staff Attorney Michael Risher, who explained,
"Back in October, after we found out that the government had just acquired a new supply of one of these lethal injection drugs, after telling the federal court that it wouldn't be able to do so until the beginning of 2011, we submitted a Public Records Act request to find out some very, very basic information about this. Where did they get it? What did they get? How much did they pay for it? The basic types of things that we as taxpayers, as voters, as people in California need to know. And we're lucky here in California because in our Constitution, we have a right to understand what our government is doing. We have a right to public documents. We have a right to know how our tax dollars are being spent. And so that's what we did. We exercised that right under the California Constitution, under the California Public Records Act, really to try to find out very, very basic information about what our government is doing. What made us particularly suspicious is that instead of simply telling us what was going on, the CDCR stalled and stalled again and then simply refused to comply with the law that says they have to tell us, if not what they're doing, at least when they're going to tell us what they're doing. And after a couple months, we realized that in order to get any of the information that the people of this state are entitled to, we'd have to go to court. And we did that, and we very quickly got hundreds upon hundreds of pages of documents that really started to paint a picture of the lengths that California has been going to acquire these lethal injection drugs.
So it was the ACLU of Northern California that went to court and got the documents describing California's lethal drug shortage that Stephen Colbert satirized, and those documents turned out to be an informational treasure trove, as ACLU lawyer Linda Lye continued explaining.
After we filed suit, the judge ordered the CDCR to turn over an initial set of documents, and it may look like a stack of papers, but it was really a treasure trove of information. The papers, many of which came heavily redacted, lots of information blacked out, and we're still litigating with CDCR to get the stuff that's been blacked out. But even the stuff that's been blacked out, even with the stuff that's been blacked out, it's a fascinating and troubling story that's been revealed. Basically, CDCR left no stone unturned in their search for sodium thiopental. First, they identified a source in Pakistan and tried to import it, but the feds wouldn't let them. Then they tried banging down the doors of every single community hospital that they could find, asking for the drug. There seems to have been a nationwide AG sort of listserv. Hey guys, anyone else been able to find some sodium thiopental? What do you recommend?
And it was California's frantic international search for a new supply of lethal drugs for its death penalty that provided the further fodder for Stephen Colbert's satire that you can see in this clip.
England did have sodium thiopental, but the shipment was stopped at the border for inspection by the Food and Drug Administration, which is understandable. There are lives at stake here. If there's something wrong with that drug, somebody could not die.
And now the ironic contradiction of trying to find a safe supply of a lethal drug should be one indication that something unreasonable is going on here, but the need for the public to understand the real pointlessness of the process is something Michael Risher further explained here.
The public needs to understand what's involved in the death penalty. At a time here in California where we are cutting important services, cutting police officer jobs, cutting our teachers' salaries and their jobs, why the government is spending such a huge amount of resources, employee time, hiring consultants, sending people all over the place to try to acquire lethal injection drugs, when the legality of the state's lethal injection process is still up in the air. We don't even know whether the courts will ever allow these drugs to be used in lethal injection. And so why is the state spending tens of thousands of dollars to acquire drugs that might, like the last batch did, simply expire without ever being used? We think people, again, have a right to know that. Whatever you think about the death penalty, you have a right to know how the government is spending your tax dollars. You have a right to know what the government is doing in your name.
And knowing what the government is doing in my name is particularly important when what the government is doing is so ridiculous, and no one could drive that point home better than the king of ridicule, Stephen Colbert, who continued recounting California's escapades in this clip.
Luckily, just when it seemed like this story of state-sponsored execution wouldn't have a happy ending, California got help from right next door. Arizona agreed to lend California a cup of death. Nation, it's these kind of stories of neighbors helping neighbors that really fill your heart with joy. Or if you're on death row, 12 grams of sodium thiopental.
Now, Stephen Colbert and his writers did a good job of creating some amusing lines there, but amazingly, I think nothing they wrote actually topped the punchline California's death penalty bureaucracy wrote in all seriousness to show appreciation for Arizona's charity, as Stephen Colbert described it here.
I don't think that act of charity went unappreciated. California Department of Corrections Undersecretary Scott Kernan went out of his way to send a thank you email, writing, and I quote, "You guys in Arizona are lifesavers."
Now again, as amusing as that was, the details of the deal California worked out with Arizona were even more ironic, as Linda Lye went on to explain.
They ended up doing what can only be described as a drug swap with Arizona. Arizona had some drugs that we needed, and we had some drugs that Arizona needed. So California and Arizona corrections officials negotiated a deal. And there was an exchange. After the exchange was solidified, one of the California corrections officials, in an email to an Arizona corrections officials, said, "You guys in Arizona are lifesavers. Buy you a beer the next time I'm that way." It's remarkable to us that they had no sort of sense of irony, but they were absolutely determined to get the drugs necessary to kill people on California's death row. They ended up getting the drugs from the United Kingdom, and there the story sort of trails off, and we've submitted further Public Records Act requests to get more current information.
And it's important to get more information and to keep an eye on this wasteful bureaucracy rife with ironic contradictions, because, as Natasha Minsker, the ACLU of Northern California's death penalty policy director, argued,
while officials with the California Department of Corrections are scouring the globe looking for lethal injection drugs, what's going on in the rest of California? Cops are being laid off, schools are being closed, hospitals are short of supplies. Really, is this what we should be doing with our scarce resources? California, we can do better. We can replace the death penalty with life without the possibility of parole. We can make our communities safe. We can hold offenders accountable by keeping them in prison forever and making them work and pay restitution to the victims. And in the process, we'll save $1 billion that we can invest in actually making our communities safer, stopping gang violence, and keeping kids in school. It's time to make a better choice.
And what Natasha Minsker said there is true, because as you can see documented at aclunc.org/cutthis, the death penalty is going to cost California $1 billion over the next 5 years, which is too much for too little, I think, even if you find the death penalty emotionally satisfying. But I want to know what you think. Should California really spend $1 billion over the next 5 years administering a death penalty that creates government escapades that read like they were written by Franz Kafka or maybe Lewis Carroll? And about those ironic contradictions, can a system really be rational that searches for FDA-approved lethal drugs and calls finding them a lifesaver?
YouTube, you decide.